Oh, hello there. I was making this Nintendo Switch 2 responsive using container query units. And I realized that this D-pad here with the 4 buttons up, right, down, and left was incredibly difficult to do. The first few iterations with CSS Grid that I had in my mind worked out, and I also thought of some other solutions as well. And I just wanted to go over those with you. I'll head on down to Krita. I have the screenshot from the Switch 2. And looking at this D-pad here, I'll create a new paint layer and create a container grid. So this is just emulating a div that has a style of display grid on it. And the first solution I had was a 2-column layout. And you're thinking, that does not line up. Because, yeah, look at that. That does not line up. But if we have a 2-column grid and each button is in its own column and row, boop, 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 pop. Still doesn't line up, but we could rotate that. And this was my first thought, is to rotate a 2-column grid. Doesn't quite match up here, but that's okay. Though, once we rotate it, we would also have to rotate all the little triangles within each button, and that would just be very difficult to maintain. And then you have all these shadows, the x-axis and the y-axis of all those shadows. You'd have to think in 45 degrees, and that's incredibly difficult. We'll get rid of this paint layer, and I'll show you my next solution that I had, which was actually a 3-column layout. So 1, 3 columns, make it 3 rows. So we have a 3-column layout, and you can already tell that the buttons just fit within a particular column and row. So with CSS Grid, you can specify grid column 2, starting at the 2nd column line and ending at the 3rd column line to say, I want that button to be in the 2nd column. It's kind of weird because 3 is involved, but CSS, you do you. With the left button, we could force it into the 2nd row. For the right button, we could force it into the 2nd row and put it on the 3rd column line, starting on the 3rd and ending on the 4th. And for the last one, the bottom, we pretty much do the same thing. We put it on the 3rd row, and we say starting at the 2nd column line and ending on the 3rd column line. Though you could get a little bit more complex with this and say, I want the first button to span 3 columns, and then justify that button within those 3 columns. I want the left button to span 1 column, the right button to span 2 columns, and then justify it to the end. Then I say for the last bottom button, span 3 columns and do the same thing, justify it to the center. Now, there is another solution that's much easier than this, and it just deals with Flexbox. Because if you think about it, there's not really much going on. I was just overthinking it, and that's my big problem. You have one container, flex container, a second flex container, and a third flex container. Justify content center for the first, justify content space between for the second, and justify content center for the last one. If you really want to get crazy, I was thinking in the shower, just like my many shower thoughts, that we could actually use radial gradients to make these buttons. With one container, I'll say one container, whoop, I'll have 4 gradients that represent each button. So it's a gradient with a very hard stop, a radial gradient with a very hard stop, radial gradient, very hard stop, and another one, a 4th one. It would get a little bit more complex if we tried to do these triangles, but we might be able to get away with having separate elements as conic gradients, which would help you create that triangle. The problem with this approach is, how would you get these shadows on the top and the bottom, these highlights and shadows on the top and the bottoms of the buttons? You could use filter drop shadow because that takes the overall shape of your element, whether it's text or, gradients or anything, and applies a shadow below them. But it would be extremely difficult to get that positioning correct, which is why having individual elements with box shadow would do you a lot of good. Those were the thoughts in my head, but I want to show you the code that I actually ended up with. And it's not the easiest solution, but I'll show you anyway. I'm going to show off the red square here with the green buttons, and we'll go down to the control pad. I ended up with a 3-column layout. Now if we inspect this D-pad and toggle this grid button here, we can see, boop, boop, I'll zoom it in for you. This is the first starting column line, and the last is 4. So we count 1, 2, 3, and 4. I forcibly placed each element onto the grid using grid column and grid row. So nth child, we take the first one that's up and we put it in the second column, ending at the third column. It's kind of hard to see, but you go from the second one, the third one, the fourth one. Yeah, I just plopped them on. And I got my layout that I needed. I should have went with the Flexbox solution, just using justify content space between, maybe having some negative margins so that I could really match those spacing between the buttons. But, I did it. It's all good. I was going to make a video about creating a responsive Nintendo Switch 2, but I got super wiped and I realized that the most intricate part was the D-pad. And there was also one other part, and that's this little tiny home button. I took a square, I squished it a little with scale, and then I clipped half of it because the roof had a rounded corner, so I needed to use a square with border radius. But it needed to be a triangle as well, so I used clip path polygon to chop it off. And of course, because it's a little squished, it's not an exact square, I used scale.
I will leave the Nintendo... Oh my god, please! I will leave the Nintendo Switch 2 responsive container query thingy in Codepen, link in the description. If there's any CSS questions that you have, please leave a comment down below and I will answer them as best as I can. And now go CSS your keys! Oh, yeah!